course, the president had some mixed messages. We heard first that he was seeing progress in free trade negotiations with Japan. But when it came to China, he said that the U.S. was really not ready for a deal there. Can these bilateral negotiations, whether it's with Japan or the EU, if successful, help offset some of that uncertainty that we're going to get if we continue to see this prolonged trade war between the U.S. and China?
Well, I think if certainly, Sherry, if there was some relief on the Japan front, also the EU front, that would help. But I think China is in a little bit of a different situation here. I think it's important when we talk about these trade wars and trade spats to distinguish sort of three elements that are going on from the US point of view. One is the overall issue of President Trump doesn't like the fact that the US runs such a large trade deficit and sees that as really reflecting unfair trade practices. That's a more generic issue, but obviously the countries with the biggest surpluses with the US are in the firing line. That's Japan, that's Germany, that's obviously China. The second sort of issue is around these sort of national security issues, that the steel and the aluminium tariffs, the so-called Section 232 tariffs. That's much more sort of, you could call it protectionist, but there's a sort of an underlying logic there around national security interests. Those industries are getting quite depleted. But the third one, and this is really, I think, the most difficult one, and this centers on China, is concerns about China's intellectual property practices. And this, of course, is the Section 301 action that the US has taken. So when people talk about, a trade deal with China, what is this trade deal? It really has to be something that satisfies the US and the president in particular, that China is actually changing its basic practices of state-led capitalism, and that's really quite difficult to deliver.
As we continue to see then these two giants battle it out for geopolitical, technological supremacy around the world, what will be the economic fallout for neighboring countries, countries that depend on relationships between China and the US? Will they need to choose?
Well, I think a lot of countries, over the longer term, this is a little bit like these giant geopolitical tectonic plates are rubbing up against each other. And again, that's a very structural issue. It's not going to go away. So I think various countries, depending on their geopolitical and their geographic location, choosing sides will be perhaps a little bit too strong a term, but they will have to hedge and really sort of manage the relationships with both of these economic and geopolitical giants. But in terms of economic fallout in the immediate term, there will be some trade diversion if there is continued stress in the China-US economic relationship. So there'll be some benefits for other countries, but overall, obviously, it would be a negative for the global economy.
Paul, how long do you see this taking to play out? We heard from one Chinese official saying this could drag on until 2035, and while most people do expect a resolution eventually, are we looking at a decades-long process here?
I think, Paul, that's probably the better framework to think about this. I mean, certainly up until the 2020 elections, but beyond that as well. Again, I think the problem is that again, the China issue really goes back to the Section 301 actions. And if you remember, when President Trump came in, and this was a major theme of his around trade, about trade needing to be fair and free, but also fair, and hopefully balanced. That's perhaps a difficult trio to get. But he launched in August of 2017, he asked the USTR to do an investigation into China's trade practices, its technology practices, essentially accusing China of using various techniques to engage in forced technology transfer and, in some cases, outright technology theft. That report from the USTR, the trade representative Lighthizer, came out in March 2018. So here we are a year and a bit later, and the issue is still percolating along. US put the pressure on China to change. China came back and said, this is what we can do, but it's not satisfactory to the US. And I think the reason it's not satisfactory is that how do you solve this problem? It's really sort of almost systemic in the Chinese system, and it's much easier said than done to change the basic behavior of a state-led capitalist model, the SOEs, the technology issues, and then you've got this 2025, China 2025, a program lurking in the background where I think there's been a bit of a wake-up call to the US that it stands to lose technological leadership in a whole range of fields if it doesn't start adopting a different and much tougher stance to China. So I don't see any way in which China, maybe they can try and fudge this, but will that fudge work on the US side? I really don't see any short-term way in which the Chinese can satisfy President Trump if he's really got his teeth into this bone, which he appears to have.